Sweet Bluebells by Chris Harvey. The day was hot and sticky, and it was getting hotter. Brian Davis drained the lemonade from his glass and screwed up his face. The liquid was warm, just like everything else this day. He placed the glass on the floor, swiveled around on the bunk, and gazed out of the spotlessly clean caravan window. He sighed. He was unhappy and bored. Bored sick. There was nothing for him to do at all. He was on holiday, staying in a caravan with his parents. It was his first time, and hopefully, as far as he was concerned, his last. His parents might like it, but he hated it, especially with it being situated where it was, right in the middle of a crummy old field miles away from anywhere. The nearest shops were 5 miles away, and the only things nearby were a farm, the owner of which had given Brian's dad permission to put the caravan in the field, and a church which, from what Brian had already seen of it, had a graveyard. Brian shifted his gaze from the monotonous view through the window and turned to look at his dad, who was sitting on the bunk nearest the caravan door. Alan Davis was reading a newspaper, dressed only in a pair of horrible, as far as Brian was concerned, multicoloured shorts and a pair of sandals without socks. The bottom edge of the newspaper rested on his navel, gripped between a crease in his paunch. He was dunking biscuits into a steaming mug of coffee as he read, never shifting his eyes from the print of the page for one moment. Brian shook his head. A day like this, and his dad was drinking hot coffee. But that was typical of his father. He was always the same. Brian scowled. As far as he was concerned, his parents were selfish. They hadn't asked him where he'd wanted to go or what he'd wanted to do. No, if they wanted a boring holiday in the middle of a boring field miles away from anywhere, then so did everyone else. And if they didn't, then it was just tough. But this wasn't the sort of holiday for him. He wanted a holiday of action and adventure, of fairgrounds, of cool swimming pools, of amusement arcades and golden sandy beaches and large, luscious ice creams. That was what he called a holiday. Damn it! Brian was suddenly yanked out of his thoughts. He looked up and had to bite his tongue to stop himself from bursting into a giggle. His dad had allowed one of the biscuits to soak for just a second too long in his coffee, and as he lifted the sodden confectionery from mug to mouth, it had broken away and fallen to the newspaper with a soggy thud. Letting out a grunt of complaint, Alan Davis jumped to his feet and moved quickly to the caravan door. He leant outside and began to wipe the sticky mess from the paper with his middle finger, his face creased with disgust. Brian turned away and gazed back out of the window, scared in case his dad might see how amused he was. Brian's eyes scanned lazily over the range of high mountains about half a mile away. Things wouldn't have been so bad if his friend Jimmy had come along with him. Then they could have gone over to the mountains and tried to climb them. On his own, he just didn't feel up to it. Straighten your face, son, for God's sake. Brian turned and found himself staring into the glaring face of his father. What in God's name is the matter with you, eh? Brian didn't say anything. He just lowered his head and stared at his feet. Well, come on, just what is wrong with you? Ever since we arrived, you've been sitting there sulking like a soft child. He lifted his hand and pointed past Brian towards the window. You're supposed to be enjoying yourself out there, not sitting around in here sulking. Get outside in the fresh air. It's a glorious day. Go and explore. Brian looked up again. Like where? He asked sarcastically. Alan Davis stared at his son as if the answer was obvious. What do you mean, like where? Are you blind or just plain stupid, lad? Brian lowered his gaze again, remaining silent. Oh, I give up with you. If I were 13, I'd be dying to get out there and explore. I just can't work you out at all. And then Brian suddenly remembered the old derelict church that they passed on the way. and he quickly decided that he might as well go, if only to get away from his parents. There was nothing else to do. Without giving it a second thought, he stood and strode peevishly over to the door. But as he was about to step out, his dad stopped him. "Where are you going?" Brian halted momentarily. "I'm going exploring, like you said." Then he continued through the door before his dad had any time to react. Outside, bikini-clad and sunbathing in a deck chair, Helen Davis heard someone step out of the caravan and looked up, but her eyes quickly narrowed again as she was blinded for a moment. She lifted a hand to shield the orbs from the sun's glare and saw that it was Brian, her son. She was surprised that he was walking away without saying where he was going, but had noticed that he'd seemed unhappy since arriving and suspected that he wasn't enjoying himself. "Brian? What?" He continued to walk away. "Where are you off to?" Brian spun around to face her, but continued walking backwards. "I'm just going for a walk, all right." He completed the remaining 180 degrees and continued on his way. Helen thought about making after him to demand that he cheer up, but the thought just as quickly evaporated. She didn't want to make him worse. It was his holiday as well, and she couldn't be bothered getting out of the deck chair anyway. The heat had sapped all her energy. She watched after him a few seconds more, her lips forming a pout. Then she sighed and relaxed back into the canvas of the chair. She closed her eyes. Helen's flesh was already showing the telltale signs of the sun's tenderization. In another couple of hours, she would almost certainly be regretting her dreams of the body bronze. The afternoon was really becoming a scorcher. Brian had slowed his pace since leaving the caravan, and he was breathing heavily and perspiring profusely, the sweat beads on his brow swelling only to metamorphose into rivulets of salty water which trickled down his ruddy face. Some of it leaked into his eyes and stung them, and some of it seeped into his mouth, and he could taste the saltiness. Brian stopped and dabbed his face with the hem of his t-shirt. He didn't know exactly where the church was, but he was sure that he was on the right road. It couldn't be far away. Taking a long and needed breath, he strolled on along the narrow country lane, hoping that the church would appear soon. And then he stopped, a smile of satisfaction replacing his uncertain frown. He squinted. Yes, there, through a gap in the trees, he could make out a church steeple. It was still a fair walk to it, but he didn't mind now that he knew that his goal lay ahead. His hot and sticky body found a new energy, and he strode on now towards it. The church had obviously been derelict for some time. All the windows were either smashed or boarded up, the steeple clock had been stopped for years, and one of the hands was missing from one of the four faces. Other signs that Mother Nature had taken her course were also visible in the graveyard itself. The grass hadn't seen shears nor mower for at least 5 years, Brian decided, and was clearly overgrown with weeds and wild flowers. Some of the smaller gravestones were completely hidden within the thick mass. Brian waded through the tangled abundance. He was probably trampling over graves, he couldn't tell. He had been surprised and somewhat shocked when he had first seen the graveyard. It wasn't the typical graveyard that he had expected to see, perfectly cropped and trimmed, with narrow, worn pathways between the plots, the graves themselves topped with rectangular mounds of earth due to the excess in volume displaced by the coffin below. Brian felt uneasy. He always felt uneasy in graveyards, though he could never explain why, and as he strained to cut through the mass, he became aware of something else, a pungent odour, a sweet, sickly odour which seemed to grow stronger the further he ventured. He came to a halt near one of the graves. Here the sweet smell was overwhelming, but now he realized what caused it. Bluebells. This particular grave, and this particular grave only, was completely covered with them, though they weren't merely growing in a random scatter, but in a perfect rectangle, mimicking perfectly the coffin beneath them. Brian lifted his head and looked around. All the other graves were overgrown only with grass or weeds. A mess. Not a single other bluebell could be seen. He was puzzled. He returned his eyes to the strange grave and wondered why only that particular one was decorated so, trying to take in the least amount of breaths possible because of the sickly odour. And then a thought occurred to him, giving him an explanation. Of course! Out of all the graves in the graveyard, this one must be the only one cared for by someone, a relative of the dead person. This relative had a particular liking for bluebells, so he or she had decorated the grave of their loved one with them and had planted them in a perfect rectangle. Brian smiled. For the first time he really appreciated the beauty of the grave and the love and care and grief that had been put into it. The bluebells were perfect. But that smell... it was so rich, so sickly sweet that it was making him feel sick. And the relentless heat from the scorching sun made things worse. But he felt that he had to put up with the stench for just a little longer, just so he could read the inscription on the gravestone. The wording wasn't difficult to read. The gravestone was in extremely good condition and looked new, and Brian was quite a good reader. Here lies our dearly beloved son who was cut off in his infancy. He was loved by everyone and everything, and he too, in return, loved them. John Carter, 1994 to 2002. The colour drained from Brian's ruddy cheeks. He was totally shocked at the person's age, only 8. Only a boy and even younger than himself. No wonder the gravestone looked new. It was new. The grave was recent, not even a year old, despite the church's age and the graveyard's condition. He was stunned. For some strange reason he felt great pity for the boy, a boy he had never met in his life before. And then Brian's stomach signalled that he could take no more of the cloying, sickly stench, and he knew that if he wanted to keep his dinner down, he had to leave now. He could already feel the tightening sensation beneath his tongue, the saliva accumulating inside his mouth. He turned and sprinted through the dense vegetation towards the gate where he'd come in. He leapt through the gate, back onto the quiet lane, gulping in fresh lungfuls of country air. He had escaped the sickening stench just in time, and his rising dinner settled back down again. He was almost back at the caravan before he'd recovered fully. Night had thrown its black veil over the caravan, but it was still warm, the air thick and close and seemingly low in oxygen. Brian was alone. His parents had gone out to the nearest pub. "You'll be all right on your own for a few hours, won't you, Brian?" Brian felt really angry. What was he supposed to do on his own in the caravan? He'd had strict instructions that he wasn't to go out or turn on the gas cooker or do this or do that. There was nothing he could do except get into bed and go to sleep, but he wasn't tired anyway. It was horrible. Was this meant to be a holiday? Him stuck in every night with nothing to do whilst they went to the pubs and enjoyed themselves? Why couldn't he go with them? Why couldn't he have a good time as well? Everything was angry questions. If he'd gone out, he might have met someone else, someone his own age who he could make friends with, and then they could go exploring together. Brian wasn't used to being on his own and having to occupy himself. Although he was an only child, he had always had many friends and was never on his own. He felt like crying, was getting frustrated. He felt hot and his clothes were sticky against his sweaty body. He couldn't even have a bath. It was terrible. Tears now beginning to well in the corners of his eyes, Brian looked down at the bunk that he had just made up. He gritted his teeth and glared at his pillow, imagining it to be his mum and dad. He clenched his fists and jabbed out, first right, then left, again and again, over and over, grunts of pure teenage aggression hissing through his teeth. But it only took a few seconds before his arms began to ache and he became breathless. He collapsed exhausted onto the bunk, gasping for breath. As his heartbeat began to slow, Brian found himself thinking back to his visit to the graveyard. The age of the boy, the freshness of the grave, and, strangest of all, that overwhelming, sickening, sweet smell of the bluebells. The bluebells that had been planted and grew in such a perfect rectangle on the grave. The bluebells that had almost caused him to be sick, such was the potency of their odour. Who had planted them there? There were no houses close by. The nearest was about 4 or 5 miles away, so whoever had planted them would have to visit the graveyard regularly at least once a week to keep the grave so neat and tidy and the bluebells under control to make sure that they didn't grow out of the rectangle. But the thick and dense grass didn't look as if it had been disturbed at all, and he thought that a little odd. Strange. There was a noise outside the caravan. Brian's attention was suddenly yanked back to the present, and he sat bolt upright on his bunk. He stared towards the caravan door from where the sound had come. He knew he had definitely heard something, but what? A cat? A rat? Some wild animal? This was the countryside, and all sorts of creatures came out at night. Surely his parents weren't back yet. Maybe they hadn't liked the pub and had decided to come back early. But he hadn't heard the car. He held his breath and listened, but could hear nothing. He exhaled and moved to lie down. 3 knocks rapped upon the caravan door. Brian jerked back up and this time stood, raw fear now gripping, squeezing him tightly. He could hear another thumping sound as well, but it wasn't like the first 3 knocks, and at first he couldn't quite place where it came from. And then he realized. It was coming from inside his head, his own heartbeat, his blood surging through his veins, pounding inside his skull, and it was starting to make his head ache. Images flashed through his mind as if glimpsed from a flickbook. Mad axeman, hooded maniac with a shotgun, escaped lunatic. Then worse, vampire, werewolf, mummy. The horrible creature out of that film he saw with Jimmy last week. The images got worse and worse, and Brian's terror grew and grew. "Please let me in." The muffled voice came from outside. It was the voice of a young boy. Brian let the stale air in his lungs gush out of his mouth, and his frozen body became pliable again. He couldn't help but chuckle with utter relief. How could he have been so stupid? Maniac! Werewolf! He mocked and laughed at himself as he moved towards the door to open it. This was no monster. It was just a child, a young boy who had probably got lost or something. Okay, so maybe it was a little strange that he was out so late at night, but Brian was too relieved to question that. He reached the door and turned the key, smiling again. Maybe it was someone he could make friends with, someone he could go out and explore with and climb those mountains with, just like he'd wanted to. Maybe. Without a second thought, Brian pulled across the latch and pushed open the door. The stench hit him like a physical blow in the face. He reeled backwards into the caravan, moaning and gagging as nausea engulfed him. Tears welled in his eyes and saliva in his mouth. His tongue tickled underneath, and he could feel his stomach heaving under his ribs. A rancid stench of rot and putrefaction tortured his lungs. From the exterior darkness came a clear, high-pitched voice. The voice of a child. A young boy. "I've come to keep you company." Its tone was insane, mocking. Brian crawled into the farthest corner of the caravan, choking and swallowing in an attempt to keep his rising bile down. His nostrils were thick with the rancid odour of decaying flesh. And now a figure, a short figure, human in shape, stepped in through the door. An invisible hand clutched Brian's heart and squeezed it tightly in its fist as his eyes registered the vile monstrosity that now advanced towards him. Something about it seemed familiar, but at first, head spinning, he couldn't think why. He found himself staring into the thing's eyes, wondering why they were white and seemed to be moving, wondering why bits kept falling from them, reminding him of moving grains of white rice. And then he recognized maggots. They wriggled free of the nose and mouth too. Brian could feel his supper making its way up from his stomach, and he took in the vile thing that moved even closer. The grey, mushy, rotting flesh, the straggly hair, clumps missing, the sunken face and stretched skin, the tattered and soiled rags that had once been its clothing, the bits of grass and weeds, some with roots still attached, that hung from it in several places. And some of them had blue things on the ends. Familiar. And again that mouth and those eyes, writhing outlets for the wriggling rice. Then he realized why it looked somehow familiar. His vision was beginning to blur, but he managed to hold on to the recognition and almost smiled at the irony. He hadn't been far wrong at first when he'd envisioned all those monstrosities. Yes, he had seen something just like it in a film he'd watched with Jimmy last week, the one that Jimmy's big brother had got from the video shop and they weren't meant to watch. What was it called? Zombie something or other. He couldn't remember the rest of it. But what were those blue things on the ends of the weeds? "I'm glad you liked my flowers." Again that high-pitched, mocking voice. Brian's eyes wouldn't focus, but he was grateful he was spared the sight of its vile mouth opening and the maggots falling. Vomit flooded into his mouth and he coughed and spat it out, the bitter acid burning his throat. He retched again. The thing was almost upon him. And now, through the stench of rot and decay, and even through the sourness of his own vomit, a different odour reached his nostrils. It was familiar, and began to increase in strength, overriding the stench of vomit and filth, a sweet, sickly odour. And as unconsciousness began to suck him in, Brian tried desperately to place the smell. White dots danced before his eyes. And then recognition. The blue things on the ends of the weeds and the smell. He would have smiled if he could, but unconsciousness was finally taking him away from it all. But he had remembered. The smell. The rich, sickly sweet odour of bluebells.
City.